Olivia Carter sat in her corner office, staring out at the city skyline that once felt like a reflection of her ambition. Novatech Solutions had been her life's work, a company she built from nothing, now a leader in cutting-edge software and corporate innovation. She had fought for its success, weathered financial storms, and made difficult decisions, believing that her leadership ensured a fair and progressive workplace. But the letter on her desk told a different story. It had arrived anonymously, neatly folded, and slipped under her assistant's door. At first glance, it looked like any other employee complaint. Grievances about management were inevitable in a company of this size. But as she read, Olivia felt an unease settle deep in her chest. I loved my job until I got pregnant. My workload doubled, my promotions disappeared, and my boss started treating me like I was temporary. Then they forced me out. This wasn't an accident. It happens all the time, to women like me. If you really care about this company, you'll do something about it. She had read the words a dozen times, trying to reconcile them with the company she thought she knew. HR had no reports matching this accusation. Senior leadership dismissed it as an unfortunate case, rather than systemic. But the more she investigated, the more unsettling the gaps in accountability became. Complaints about women in leadership stalling, high attrition among pregnant employees, and vague resignations whispered between the lines of polished reports. The realization was like a stone dropping into a still lake, small at first, then rippling outward. Olivia had built Novatech to be a place where talent thrived regardless of gender. But if these stories were true, her company had failed its people. And if those in charge were unwilling to give her the truth, she would find it herself. By the end of the week, Olivia Carter ceased to exist. She had always taken pride in being visible, her name on press releases, her face in business magazines. But Emma Walker, the woman she would become, was no one at all. She stripped away the polished exterior, trading her tailored suits for department store blouses and sensible shoes. Her long, sleek hair was pinned back into an unremarkable ponytail. No expensive jewelry, no commanding presence. She even changed the way she carried herself, shoulders slightly hunched instead of squared with authority. With forged credentials and a new identity, she applied through an external agency, carefully avoiding any traces that could link Emma Walker to Olivia Carter. 2 weeks later, she received a standard onboarding email, welcoming her as an administrative assistant at Novatech's corporate office. The building that had once felt like an extension of her power now seemed foreign. Without the prestige of her title, the security guard barely glanced at her. Employees brushed past her in the lobby without the polite nods or eager greetings she was accustomed to. She stepped onto the elevator, pressed the button for the 10th floor, and kept her eyes lowered. Her department was a vast open office, where rows of desks stretched under the artificial glow of fluorescent lights. At the front, a glass-walled conference room loomed, where executives gathered in hushed conversations. She knew those rooms well. She had sat in them for years, making decisions that shaped the company. But today, no one looked her way. Her new supervisor, Brad Reynolds, barely offered a greeting as he handed her a company handbook. His handshake was indifferent, his smile tight. "You'll be handling basic admin work," he said without looking up from his phone. "Schedules, meeting prep, some client correspondence. If you need something, ask Claire." Claire, a fellow assistant, shot Olivia a sympathetic look. She was warm but wary, the kind of person who had learned not to trust too quickly. Olivia took note of it. The first few days passed in a blur of small tasks and quiet observations. At first glance, nothing seemed blatantly wrong, just the usual office politics. But subtle patterns emerged. The conversations that stopped when certain women entered the room. The way promotions were discussed like a boys' club ritual. And then there were the women themselves, intelligent, capable, yet treated as though their contributions were invisible. She noticed Sophie on her second day. Sophie was one of the most efficient workers Olivia had ever seen, quick, sharp, and effortlessly balancing multiple projects. But she was also pregnant, and that fact seemed to override everything else about her in the eyes of management. "Used to be on the fast track," Claire whispered one afternoon as they sorted through files. Now they barely let her lead her own meetings. Ever since she told them about the baby, they started reevaluating her workload. Olivia watched as Sophie tried to contribute ideas in a team meeting, only for Brad to cut her off with a dismissive, "Let's circle back to that later." Later never came. She started asking quiet questions, testing how deep the problem ran. "So, Sophie's been here a while," she asked Claire casually. 7 years. Used to be Brad's right hand. Now he treats her like she's already gone. That night, Olivia stared at herself in the mirror, the weight of what she was uncovering pressing against her chest. She had come here expecting minor issues, the kind that could be fixed with a few policy changes. Instead, she found something rotten beneath the surface, a culture that thrived on quiet, systematic exclusion. A decision settled in her mind. She would take this deeper. She would put herself in their shoes. The next morning, Olivia arrived at work and placed a soft, lingering hand on her stomach as she spoke to Claire. Just enough to make a few people notice. An hour later, she let slip a casual remark. "I haven't been feeling great. It's early, but I think I might be expecting." The reaction was immediate. Brad's polite indifference sharpened into something else, something calculating. Claire's eyes widened with a mix of concern and quiet understanding. And Sophie, from across the room, looked at her with something Olivia hadn't expected. Recognition. The shift was small, almost imperceptible. But Olivia felt it. She had just become a liability. The shift in atmosphere was subtle at first. Conversations hushed when Olivia entered a room. The usual flow of emails slowed. Brad's instructions became less direct, as if he was already preparing for her absence. It wasn't overt hostility, nothing she could pinpoint and call out. It was quieter, more insidious. By the end of the first week, Olivia found herself removed from key assignments. Simple scheduling tasks were reassigned to Claire without explanation. Project documents that had once been sent to her now bypassed her entirely. When she asked Brad if there was an issue, he flashed a tight, practiced smile. "Not at all," he said. "Just thought it'd be better to lighten your workload, given your situation." "My situation," she repeated, forcing an air of curiosity rather than confrontation. "You know," he said, gesturing vaguely toward her stomach. "It's a stressful job. Didn't want to overwhelm you." She wanted to see how far he'd take it, so she didn't push. Instead, she let the silence stretch between them, watching the way his fingers tightened around his coffee cup. He was testing the waters, seeing if she'd resist. The following Monday, her name disappeared from the next quarter's project planning list. Olivia had spent the past 3 weeks proving her competence, meeting every deadline without complaint, yet she was being quietly erased. At lunch, she sat with Sophie and Claire in the break room, where a conversation was already unfolding before she even spoke. "They took me off the Arcadia project," Sophie muttered, poking at the remains of her salad. "The one I built from the ground up. They said it was a strategic shift," Claire added bitterly. "Which means Brad decided you were too fragile to handle it." Olivia stirred her tea, watching Sophie's expression shift between frustration and something dangerously close to resignation. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "What can I do?" Sophie let out a short, humorless laugh. "I could fight it, but it's my word against theirs. And even if I push back, they'll just find another way to phase me out. Might as well save myself the stress." The quiet defeat in her voice settled like a weight in Olivia's chest. That afternoon, she gathered proof. She reviewed her inbox, finding a pattern of exclusion. Emails she should have received but didn't. Meetings that were suddenly rescheduled without her knowledge. She eavesdropped on conversations, catching Brad laughing with another manager in the hallway. You see Walker's face when she saw her name off the Q3 plans? Thought she might start crying right there. Yeah, well, you know how it is. No point wasting time training someone who won't be around. Olivia clenched her jaw, fingers tightening around the folder she was carrying. The casual cruelty, the way they dismissed her without hesitation, it burned through her. That night, she sat in her small, rented apartment, staring at the evidence she had gathered. The truth was undeniable. It wasn't just oversight. It wasn't just unconscious bias. It was deliberate. They were phasing her out. She looked at her reflection in the window, seeing Emma Walker, the disposable worker. But beneath that, she saw Olivia Carter, the woman who had built this company from nothing. The woman who had trusted the wrong people to run it. The next day, she escalated her experiment. She let herself move a little slower. She winced once while reaching for a binder, making sure Brad saw. She let fatigue show on her face, allowed herself to look, just for a moment, like someone who might need a break. Brad took the bait immediately. That afternoon, he called her into his office, offering another one of his empty smiles. "I wanted to check in," he said, voice dripping with manufactured concern. "You've seemed a little tired lately. I just want to make sure you're comfortable." "I'm fine," Olivia said evenly. "Good, good," Brad nodded. "But listen, I was thinking, maybe it's best if you take a step back from some of the heavier workload. Focus on simpler tasks. Maybe even consider a temporary leave. No pressure, of course. Just something to think about." Olivia held his gaze. "A leave," she repeated. "Just for a bit. You know, take care of yourself." "I see." Brad smiled wider, mistaking her silence for hesitation rather than calculation. "Think it over," he said, standing to signal the conversation was over. No rush. But Olivia already knew her answer. That night, she stayed late, watching the office empty out. She moved through the halls unnoticed, just another faceless employee working past hours. She slipped into the records department, accessing HR files she already knew existed, but needed confirmation of. Dozens of names. Women in mid-level management who had either resigned or been quietly let go. Their departure records all looked the same. Voluntary resignations with no formal complaints, yet the exit interviews had a chilling consistency. Family obligations. Stress. Better work-life balance. Each one read like a carefully crafted excuse. Each one a woman who had been pushed until she had no choice but to leave. By the time Olivia left the building, her plan was set. Brad thought he had won. He thought he had outmaneuvered another expendable employee. He had no idea who he had been trying to erase. The morning air was thick with anticipation as Olivia walked into the office, her every step measured, her every move calculated. The weight of what she had uncovered sat heavy in her chest, but she carried it with purpose. She had spent the night compiling everything: emails, altered project assignments, exit records, and quietly recorded conversations that left no room for interpretation. This wasn't just a case of oversight or negligence. It was systemic. And now it was time to expose it. The moment she stepped onto the floor, she could feel it. The shift. The way people glanced at her, as if she had already been marked for removal. Claire looked up from her desk, concern flickering in her eyes. But Olivia gave her the smallest nod. Brad was waiting. He didn't call her into his office immediately. No, he was patient, letting her sit at her desk, letting her feel the weight of what was coming. He wanted her to squirm, to feel powerless. He had no idea who he was dealing with. By mid-morning, the email arrived in her inbox. A formal invitation to a performance review meeting scheduled for later that day. The kind of meeting that wasn't really about performance at all. Across the room, Sophie glanced at her screen and went pale. Olivia didn't have to ask. She had likely received the same email once, right before they pushed her aside. The pieces were all falling into place. When the time came, Olivia walked into the conference room without hesitation. Brad was already seated at the long glass table, flanked by two senior managers. A standard corporate ambush. The men on either side of him barely glanced up, their presence a mere formality to rubber stamp whatever decision had already been made. Brad leaned back in his chair, exuding false sympathy. "Emma, thanks for coming in. We wanted to discuss your role here at Novatech. We've noticed some concerns." Olivia folded her hands neatly on the table. "Concerns?" Brad sighed, as if burdened by the conversation. "Your performance has been slipping. Missed memos. Lack of engagement. And with your condition, we worry about whether this is the best fit for you long term." There it was. The push. The attempt to make her fold. She let the silence stretch just long enough for the tension to settle in before she reached into her bag and pulled out a thin folder. Brad's confident smirk faltered when she slid it across the table. "What's this?" he asked, his voice careful. "Documentation," Olivia said evenly. "Evidence of discrimination against pregnant employees in this company. Emails, internal communications, exit interviews, all pointing to a deliberate pattern of exclusion." Brad scoffed, flipping through the pages with feigned disinterest. But the deeper he went, the stiffer his posture became. One of the managers shifted uncomfortably. The other cleared his throat. "This is ridiculous," Brad said, but his voice wasn't as steady as before. "You can't just throw around accusations like this." "I can," Olivia said, her voice cool. "And I will, because this isn't just about me. It's about every woman you've systematically pushed out. Sophie. The ones before her. The ones you thought wouldn't fight back." Brad leaned forward, his mask cracking. "Do you really think anyone will believe some temp over senior leadership?" A slow smile curled at the edges of Olivia's lips. "Oh, I do," she said. Then she reached into her bag again, this time pulling out her phone. With one tap, the screen illuminated, revealing an ongoing recording. Brad paled. "I think they'll believe your own words," she said. The weight of what she had just done settled over the room like a thundercloud. Brad's carefully maintained composure splintered, his face shifting between disbelief and fury. The two managers stiffened, suddenly realizing the full extent of the situation. She had backed them into a corner. And now, it was time for the final reveal. With deliberate calm, Olivia reached up, unclipped her hair, and let the long, sleek strands fall past her shoulders, the first recognizable piece of the woman they all thought was a ghost. Then, she sat back, watching realization dawn in their eyes. "Surprise," she murmured. The silence in the conference room was suffocating. Brad's face had drained of all color, his usual smug confidence shattered. The two senior managers beside him shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Olivia and the damning evidence she had laid before them. They had come expecting an easy elimination, a quiet dismissal of another disposable employee. Instead, they had walked straight into a reckoning. Brad finally found his voice, though it lacked its usual sharpness. This is a misunderstanding." Olivia arched a brow. "Is it?" She tapped her phone, playing back a crystal-clear snippet of Brad's earlier conversation. "No point wasting time training someone who won't be around." The room tensed. One of the senior managers visibly recoiled, while the other cleared his throat and straightened his tie as if suddenly aware of how deep they were in. Brad's jaw tightened. He had spent years controlling narratives, shifting blame, and burying problems beneath corporate jargon. But this was irrefutable. Olivia leaned forward. "For years, you've pushed women like me out of the company under the guise of strategic shifts and concerns for their well-being. You created an environment where pregnancy wasn't just a temporary change. It was a death sentence for a career. And you did it quietly, efficiently, without leaving any room for direct complaints. Until now." Brad opened his mouth, then closed it again. His mind was scrambling for a counterattack, a way to spin this in his favor. Olivia didn't give him the chance. "I've already forwarded everything to legal," she continued smoothly. "And a few key journalists who would love to expose how Novatech rewards its female employees." She tilted her head, watching the beads of sweat form at his temple. "You're out of moves, Brad." One of the senior managers, a man Olivia recognized as Mitchell Grayson, cleared his throat. "Ms. Carter," he began carefully, his tone shifting now that he knew who he was speaking to. "Surely there's a way to resolve this internally." Olivia didn't break eye contact. "Is there?" Mitchell glanced at Brad, clearly weighing his options. He was a survivor, someone who had built a career on knowing when to abandon a sinking ship. And right now Brad was sinking fast. "There's no need for this to become public," Mitchell said carefully. "Perhaps a restructuring is in order. A reassessment of leadership." Brad snapped his head toward him. "What?" Mitchell didn't look at him. His focus remained on Olivia, calculating the best way to cut their losses. "If this goes public, it won't just be Brad who takes the hit," he said. "The company's reputation will suffer. Stocks will drop. Lawsuits will pile up. That benefits no one." Olivia folded her arms. And, Mitchell continued, "I believe Novatech would be better served under new leadership." A sharp, strangled sound came from Brad's throat. "You can't be serious." Mitchell finally turned to him, his expression blank. "You made yourself expendable the moment you became a liability." For the first time since this confrontation began, Brad looked truly afraid. He wasn't just losing an argument, he was losing everything. His power, his influence, the very foundation of his career was crumbling beneath him. Olivia let the moment stretch, allowing him to sit in the weight of his downfall. Then she stood. "I expect a formal resignation on my desk by the end of the day." Brad's lips parted, but no words came. There was nothing left to say. As she turned to leave, Claire and Sophie stood just outside the glass doors, their faces a mixture of awe and barely contained satisfaction. The rest of the office was buzzing, whispers rippling through the floor like electricity. The reckoning had begun and everyone knew it. Olivia met their gazes and gave the smallest nod before walking past them, stepping out of the shadows and into the light. She had come to uncover the truth. Now, she would rebuild something better,